The sky bled red across Gorvax Secundus, a death world, where survival was measured in heartbeats rather than years. Acid rain carved channels through the corroded landscape, hissing as it met exposed rock and the scattered remains of what had once been an Imperial outpost. The air itself was a weapon here, thick with spores that mutated flesh and choked lungs. In the twisted forests that covered the planet's surface, trees grew with bark like rusted metal, their roots digging through soil saturated with chemical death. Yogiri Takatou woke to this apocalypse with the same expression he wore when his alarm clock interrupted a good dream. His gray hair, marked by two distinctive light blue streaks, was matted with dust and something that might have been dried blood or simply the residue of atmospheric toxins. Brown eyes blinked open, taking in the alien sky with the mild annoyance of someone who had been hoping for a few more minutes of sleep. He sat up slowly, brushing dirt from his school uniform, which looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of planetary devastation. The last thing he remembered was the Abyss backlash, a metaphysical rejection so violent it had torn him from his own reality and deposited him here, wherever here happened to be. The dimensional membrane between worlds had spat him out like a body rejecting foreign tissue. Around him, the landscape spoke of recent violence. Craters pockmarked the ground, still smoking despite the constant rain. Equipment lay scattered and broken, Imperial issue from the look of it, though Yogiri had no frame of reference for such things. Bodies were absent, but the dark stains on the rust-colored earth told their own story. Something had passed through this place with terrible purpose, and nothing human had survived the encounter. In the distance, Yogiri could hear the sound of running. Not the panicked sprint of civilians fleeing disaster, but the disciplined retreat of soldiers who knew that stopping meant death. The footfalls were heavy, synchronized, the rhythm of men in armor moving as fast as their equipment would allow. They were coming closer, and behind them came something else. The ground trembled with a rhythm that had nothing to do with footsteps. It was the percussion of living mass. Thousands of pounds of chitin and muscle driving forward with single-minded hunger. The trees shuddered as something massive pushed through them, branches snapping like kindling. The sound that accompanied this movement was worse than any roar, a chittering hiss that seemed to come from 1,000 mouths at once, the collective voice of a swarm that thought with one mind and hungered with 1,000,000 stomachs. Yogiri stood still, brushing at his uniform, in a gesture more habitual than useful. His movements were unhurried, almost lazy, as if he had all the time in the world to make himself presentable. The trembling ground and approaching cacophony of predatory sounds might as well have been background noise in a busy cafeteria for all the reaction they provoked. The stormtroopers burst into the clearing like men fleeing the end of the world, which in a very real sense they were. Their carapace armor was scored and cracked, their laser guns gripped in hands that trembled from exhaustion rather than fear. These were veteran soldiers of the Astra Militarum, men who had seen horrors that would break civilian minds. But what pursued them now had pushed them to the edge of breaking. They saw Yogiri standing there in his school uniform, apparently oblivious to the danger, and their formation faltered. The sergeant leading them, a grizzled veteran, whose face was more scar tissue than flesh, opened his mouth to shout a warning. The words died in his throat as the Tyranids arrived. They came as a tide of alien flesh, a nightmare rendered in chitin and claws. Hormagaunts led the charge, their blade limbs designed for nothing but the act of killing, their eyeless faces locked onto the fleeing soldiers with predatory focus. Behind them came larger forms, Tyranid warriors, whose every movement spoke of terrible intelligence guiding terrible strength. The swarm moved with a coordination that no natural creatures could achieve, each organism a cell in a larger body, each death meaningless as long as the hive endured. Yogiri looked at the approaching wall of alien horror with the same mild interest he might show a particularly persistent fly. The Tyranids registered his presence, their collective consciousness, noting this new potential biomass with the same hunger it felt for everything living. Feeding tendrils quivered in anticipation. Toxic weapons prepared to reduce flesh to component proteins. The swarm surged forward and stopped. The Hormagaunts in the vanguard simply ceased to exist. There was no flash of light, no sound of impact, no visible cause. One moment they were living weapons honed by millennia of evolution. The next, they were biological refuse, collapsing to the ground in heaps of suddenly inert matter. Their death was so complete, so absolute, that even the hive mind's connection to them simply vanished, as if those organisms had never existed at all. The Tyranid warriors behind them fared no better. Their enhanced intelligence, meant to coordinate lesser organisms and adapt to battlefield conditions, processed what had just occurred and reached for understanding. The hive mind directing them analyzed the threat-calculated responses, prepared countermeasures. Then those warriors died too, their bodies crumpling mid-stride, synaptic connections, severing organs, failing. Life extinguished between one thought and the next. The swarm faltered. For a species that knew no fear, that had consumed entire worlds and adapted to every weapon the galaxy could produce, this moment of hesitation was unprecedented. The hive mind probed at the anomaly standing before it, trying to understand what had just killed dozens of its organisms without any apparent action. Yogiri yawned, covering his mouth with one hand, in a gesture of ingrained politeness that seemed ludicrous under the circumstances. He was still tired. The dimensional transfer had been exhausting, and being woken up by all this noise was just annoying. Behind the faltering swarm, something larger moved. The hive tyrant that served as this tendril's command organism pushed through its lesser kin with casual disregard for their existence. It stood 3 times the height of a man, its form a blasphemous fusion of insectoid and reptilian features, armored in chitin plates thick enough to turn artillery fire. 4 arms ending in weapons both biological and terrible, gestured with terrible grace. The synapse field it projected was a psychic hammer, coordinating the swarm, overriding individual survival instincts with the hive mind's implacable will. The hive tyrant regarded Yogiri with compound eyes that saw in spectrums human perception could never encompass. It recognized prey, but also something else, something its ancient genetic memory had no category for. The hive mind speaking through this avatar made its assessment. The anomaly was a threat. Threats were to be neutralized. The logic was simple, absolute, and had served the Tyranids across countless galaxies. The hive tyrant intended to kill Yogiri Takatou. It died. The massive creature's body hit the ground with force enough to shake the clearing, but it was already just meat by the time it landed. Every synapse in its enhanced brain had fired once and then gone silent. Every organ had ceased function simultaneously. The connection to the greater hive mind, that psychic tether, that made it more than just a beast, severed so completely that it left a wound in the warp itself. The remaining Tyranids stood frozen, suddenly directionless, their coordinating intelligence gone. Without the hive tyrant's synapse field, they were dangerous animals rather than cells of a greater organism. They milled about in confusion, some attacking each other in the absence of clearer targets, others simply standing still as their limited individual intelligence tried and failed to process the loss of direction. Then they died too. All of them. Every Tyranid organism in a 100-meter radius simply stopped living. Their deaths created a zone of absolute silence, a circle where the ambient sounds of a death world continued. but the chittering, hissing background noise of the swarm ceased utterly. The stormtroopers stood in stunned disbelief. Their sergeant, who had served the Emperor for 30 years and thought he had seen every miracle and horror the galaxy could produce, found himself without words. One of the younger soldiers, barely past his first campaign, dropped to his knees in an unconscious gesture of religious awe. Yogiri looked at the carnage his automatic defense had created, his expression unchanged. He hadn't consciously decided to kill anything. The defense mechanism that defined his existence had simply recognized threats to his life and eliminated them with the same impersonal efficiency it always had. Intent to harm was all it needed. Capability was irrelevant. The gulf between intention and action meant nothing to a power that existed outside conventional causality. He noticed the soldiers staring at him and offered a small apologetic shrug. It was the gesture of someone who had accidentally knocked over a vase, not someone who had just erased an entire tyrannid swarm from existence. The sergeant found his voice, though it came out as a croak. Words in low Gothic spilled from his lips, prayers and benedictions mixed with tactical assessment. The other soldiers joined in a ragged chorus of voices that spoke of miracles and the Emperor's protection. They were seeing what they expected to see, filtering this impossible event through the only lens their faith-indoctrinated minds possessed. Yogiri didn't understand a word of it. Whatever language they spoke, it wasn't Japanese or any Earth language he recognized. The sounds were harsh, guttural, full of religious fervor that meant nothing to him. He raised a hand in a small wave, the universal gesture of acknowledgement, and wondered if there was anywhere on this miserable planet where he could get some sleep. Around the clearing, the ambient sounds of Warhammer 40K continued unchanged. Acid rain fell. Toxic winds blew. The planet's native fauna made their predatory calls in the distance. But where the tyrannids had died, there was a quality to the silence that went beyond mere absence of sound. It was a void, a gap in the natural order. Where the tyrannids had fallen, their connection to the greater hive consciousness had been severed so completely that it left a wound in the psychic fabric of reality. The warp, that roiling dimension of thought and emotion that pressed against material space, recoiled from this place. It was as if a dead zone had appeared in the Imperium, a space where psychic energy simply ceased to exist. The phenomenon would later be designated the silence field by Adeptus Mechanicus analysts, but in this moment, it was simply an uncomfortable absence, a wrongness that pressed against the edges of perception. The stormtroopers felt it without understanding, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with standing at the edge of something fundamentally antithetical to life, as the Imperium understood it. Yogiri, ignorant of the metaphysical implications of his presence, simply wanted to find somewhere dry to sit down. The rain was starting to soak through his uniform, and the chemical composition of the water was probably doing terrible things to the fabric. He began walking, picking a direction at random, stepping over the corpses of organisms that had crossed galaxies, consuming worlds. Behind him, the stormtroopers watched him go, their prayers growing louder, more fervent. They would report this. They would tell their officers of the miracle they had witnessed, of the saint or angel, or whatever the boy had been who had appeared to deliver them from certain death. They would be believed and disbelieved in equal measure, their accounts filed away in the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium. But the dead zone remained. The silence spread, and in the roiling chaos of the warp entities older than human civilization felt something impossible occur, a space where the Imperium could not reach, a void in the eternal storm. An absence that spoke louder than any presence could. The end had walked into Warhammer 40,000, and the galaxy would never be quite the same. The warp had no physical geography. No geography at all in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend. It was a realm of pure thought and emotion, where the collective psychic emanations of countless souls created currents and eddies in an ocean of impossible depth. Here concepts took on weight and presence. Rage burned with literal fire, despair pooled in bottomless wells. Hope shone with light that could illuminate or blind, depending on the observer's perspective. For uncounted eons, the warp had followed patterns terrible and beautiful in equal measure. The four great powers that dominated this realm had carved out their territories through sheer force of will and accumulated belief. Khorne's domain raged eternal, a landscape of blood and brass, where conflict never ceased. Nurgle's garden festered with diseased life rot and rebirth cycling in perpetual rhythm. Slaaneish's palace echoed with sensation, pushed beyond all limits, pleasure and pain rendered indistinguishable. Tzeentch's labyrinth shifted constantly, schemes within schemes, reflected in architecture that defied spatial logic. These were constants, if anything in the Imperium could be called constant. The great game between the gods played out across realities, demon armies clashing in wars that had no beginning and would have no end. Mortal souls drifted through this chaos, drawn to whatever power resonated with their deepest nature, fuel for conflicts that transcended time and meaning. And then, something impossible happened. The warp shuddered. Not the violent convulsions that accompanied the death of worlds or the birth of new chaos gods, but something subtler and far more disturbing. It was as if the Imperium itself had flinched, recoiling from a sensation it had no framework to process. In a realm where everything was sensation, where emotion and thought were the only currency that mattered, a void had appeared. Demons paused in their eternal conflicts, their essence flickering with confusion. Lesser entities of the warp, those fragments of consciousness, barely cohesive enough to maintain individual identity, simply dissipated when they approached the phenomenon, their psychic energy scattering like smoke in a gale. Greater demons, beings of terrible power and ancient cunning, drew back from the affected region, as if from a flame that burned colder than absolute zero. The void was not large, not in terms of the warp's infinite expanse. It was barely a pinprick, a single point, where the Imperium simply could not reach. But in a realm where thought was reality and will-shaped existence, such an absolute absence was more than disturbing. It was fundamentally wrong. There was no sensation there, no emotion, no psychic resonance of any kind. It was as if someone had excised a piece of reality itself, leaving behind not even emptiness, but the concept of nothing rendered absolute. Demons could not perceive it directly, their senses recoiling from the gap in their perception. It was a blind spot in the eye of consciousness itself, a place where the warp ceased to exist, not through destruction, but through simple negation. In his crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch felt the disturbance with an acuity that transcended normal perception. The architect of fate, whose vision encompassed countless possible futures across infinite realities, found himself staring at something he had never encountered before. A thread that led nowhere. A possibility that terminated not in outcome, but in absolute cessation. The god's form, ever shifting and impossible to fix in any single shape, stabilized for a moment as he focused his full attention on the anomaly. 9 eyes opened in configurations that would drive mortal observers mad, each one perceiving reality through different lenses of causality and probability. All 9 saw the same thing. Nothing. An absence where something should be. Tzeentch reached out with senses that could read the patterns written in star formations and the futures encoded in the fall of dice. He traced probability lines backward from the void, seeking its origin, its cause, its purpose. The threads of fate that led to this moment were clear enough. The Tyranids had encountered something on Gorvax Secundus, a human or something wearing human shape. And when they had attempted to consume this being, they had simply ceased to exist. But there was no causal mechanism. No weapon discharge, no psychic attack, no reality warping effect that his vast intelligence could detect. The Tyranids had possessed intent to kill, and then they had died. Between those two states was nothing but absence, a gap in causality itself that should not and could not exist. The god of change and schemes found himself confronted with something that had no place in any scheme, no role in any change. It simply was, and its existence negated everything around it in a way that transcended simple destruction. Destruction was change, entropy was a form of transformation. This was neither. This was cessation without process, an ending that bypassed all the steps that should lead to ending. Tzeentch spoke, and his voice rippled through the warp like the whisper of a collapsing star. The language was beyond mortal comprehension, but if translated, it might have approximated a simple statement of fact. No fate, no causality, no future at all. The god's agitation sent tremors through his domain. The crystal labyrinth shifted its configurations more rapidly, reflecting the tumult in its master's thoughts. Demon servants felt their creator's disturbance and grew uneasy in turn, that unease propagating through the warp like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. A decision was made. The anomaly required investigation, direct observation by an entity of sufficient power to survive the encounter and report back. Tzeentch reached into his domain and selected one of his demon princes, a being that had once been mortal, but had transcended that limitation through service to the architect of fate. Karduzar, the all-seeing, had been a psyker of tremendous power in life, a prophet who had foreseen his own ascension and embraced it with the fervor of absolute certainty. His transformation into a demon prince had magnified his abilities 1,000-fold. He could read thoughts across star systems, perceive futures that had not yet crystallized into present, manipulate probability itself to ensure desired outcomes. The command that came from Tzeentch was simple in its directness. Go to the material realm, find the source of the disturbance, understand it if possible, report back. Do not engage beyond observation. The emphasis on that final instruction was unusual, suggesting a caution that the changer of ways rarely displayed. Karduzar manifested on Gorvax Secundus with all the fanfare of a reality tearing itself apart to accommodate his presence. The warp rift that opened above the death world painted the toxic sky with colors that had no names in any mortal language. Demon essence coalesced into physical form, drawing on the latent psychic energy that saturated the planet's atmosphere to anchor itself in material space. The Demon Prince stood 4 times the height of a man, his form a constantly shifting amalgamation of eyes and mouths and grasping appendages. Wings spread wide not for flight, but as displays of power, each feather a screaming face frozen in prophetic ecstasy. His presence bent reality around him, natural laws becoming suggestions that he could choose to observe or ignore. He cast his perception across the planet, seeking the anomaly. His sight, which could pierce the veils between dimensions and read the stories written in quantum fluctuations, swept across Gorvax Secundus like a searchlight, illuminating every shadow. He saw the stormtroopers huddled in a makeshift shelter, their minds bright with religious fervor and trauma. He saw the dead Tyranids, their corpses already being consumed by the planet's aggressive ecosystem. He saw the patterns of recent violence etched into the landscape like scars on flesh. And he saw nothing. A gap in his perception. A space where even his enhanced senses found no purchase. The anomaly was there, walking through the toxic rain with the casual pace of someone taking an afternoon stroll. Carduzar could perceive the effects of its passage the way reality rippled around it. But the thing itself remained invisible to his psychic sight. This was impossible. He could see anything, everything that existed in material space or immaterial thought. It was the gift Tzeentch had granted him, the power that defined his existence. Yet here was something that simply refused to register a void in the shape of a human teenage boy. Carduzar reached deeper, calling on reserves of power that would have torn a mortal psyker apart from the inside. He projected his consciousness directly at the anomaly, attempting to read its thoughts, its intentions, its very nature. The effort was like trying to see by staring directly into the sun, but he persisted, driven by the need to understand and by the knowledge that failure to do so would displease his god. His perception touched the edge of Yogiri's existence and recoiled immediately. It was not that there was resistance or defense. It was that there was nothing to perceive. Where a human mind should have been a landscape of thoughts and memories and emotions, there was only void. Endless, absolute void that stretched into depths no consciousness should be able to contain. The endless void was not empty space. It was the absence of space itself. It was the concept of ending, rendered as a location, a place where all things went when they ceased to be. Staring into it was like standing at the edge of a cliff that dropped away into nothing. Not into darkness, but into the absolute termination of existence. Carduzar felt something he had not experienced since his mortal life. Fear. Pure primal terror at confronting something fundamentally antithetical to his existence. He was a being of change and transformation, his essence constantly shifting through new configurations. But the void he had glimpsed promised not transformation, but cessation, not change, but ending. He pulled back, severing the psychic connection with desperate haste. For a moment he thought he had escaped, that his perception had withdrawn cleanly. Then he felt it. A subtle shift in the fabric of reality around him. The anomaly had noticed him. More specifically, Yogiri's automatic defense had registered a threat. Something had attempted to probe his mind, to invade his thoughts, to cause him harm through psychic intrusion. Intent to harm had been established. Capability was irrelevant. The gulf between intention and action meant nothing. Carduzar, the all-seeing, died. His physical form in the material realm simply collapsed, demon essence dissipating back into the warp with unnatural speed. But his true death occurred in the Imperium, in that space where his consciousness resided between material manifestations. The connection between his essence and the warp itself severed with surgical precision. One moment he was a demon prince, a being of vast power and terrible knowledge. The next moment, he was nothing, not even a memory echoing in the currents of chaos. The warp convulsed. The death of a demon prince was not unprecedented. Such beings could be banished or temporarily destroyed. But this was different. There was no trace of Carduzar remaining. No echo of his existence. No fragment of consciousness that might eventually coalesce back into awareness. He had been erased so completely that even the warp's infinite memory held no record of what he had been. The shockwave of that absolute erasure propagated through the Imperium like a scream rendered silent. Demons felt it and retreated further from the void in material space. The four chaos gods, whose attention was usually divided across countless schemes and conflicts, all focused simultaneously on Gorvax Secundus. They saw what Tzeentch had seen. A blind spot, a place where fate terminated, a human-shaped absence that walked through the material realm, leaving void in its wake. And for the first time in countless eons, the Chaos Gods felt something that transcended their nature as embodiments of specific concepts. They felt the collective weight of witnessing something that should not exist, something that their infinite power and knowledge had no framework to comprehend. On Gorvax Secundus, unaware of the metaphysical chaos his existence had caused, Yogiri found a relatively dry cave in a cliff face and settled down to get some more sleep. The ambient radiation would probably kill a normal human in a few hours, but his automatic defense would handle that. Everything was always so loud in unfamiliar places. He hoped the noise would die down soon. In the warp, the void remained. A pinprick of absolute nothing in an ocean of everything. And the silence where Karduzar had been spoke louder than any demon's scream ever could. The disappearance of Karduzar sent ripples through the Imperium that could not be ignored. What had been a localized disturbance, a curiosity demanding investigation, had escalated into something far more significant. A demon prince did not simply vanish. Such beings were fragments of their patron gods, extensions of will and power that carried a portion of divine essence. When they were destroyed, that essence returned to its source memories and experiences, absorbed back into the greater whole. But Karduzar had not returned. There was no essence to absorb, no memories to integrate. The connection between the demon prince and Tsench had simply terminated, severed so completely that it left a wound in the god's consciousness. It was a small wound, barely noticeable in the vast tapestry of the architect of fate's awareness. But it was unprecedented. Gods did not bleed, not in any conventional sense. Yet here was something that approximated bleeding a loss, that could not be recovered or transformed into gain. The event propagated through the warp like a wave of erasure, a ripple of absolute nothing, spreading through the chaotic currents of the Imperium. Where it passed, daemon essences flickered and recoiled, lesser entities dissipating rather than risk contact with something so fundamentally wrong. The wave was not large, barely perceptible against the infinite churning of the warp, but its nature made it impossible to ignore. In the realm of Khorne, the blood god felt the disturbance and turned his attention toward it with the focus of a predator, sensing potential prey. Khorne's domain was eternal war, an infinite battlefield, where violence never ceased and bloodshed was the only currency that mattered. Here brass towers rose from lakes of spilled blood, and the screams of the slain provided an endless symphony of suffering. The blood god did not think in the way mortals understood thought. His consciousness was rage, given form. Anger refined to such purity that it transcended emotion and became a fundamental force. He perceived the void in material space and understood it only through the lens of his nature. Here was something that could not be fought. Here was an enemy that could not be challenged with blade or cannon, or the fury of charging legions. The realization did not bring sadness or acceptance. Khorne knew only rage, and now that rage turned inward, eating at itself like a fire-denied fuel. His brass throne cracked under the pressure of his grip, molten metal running between fingers large enough to crush battle tanks. The entirety of his domain shuddered demon armies pausing in their endless conflicts as their god's fury washed over them in waves. But there was something else beneath the rage. Not fear, for Khorne knew no fear, but a recognition that this anomaly existed outside the great game, outside the cycle of conflict that defined his existence. It was not an opponent. It was simply other and against something so fundamentally alien to his nature, even infinite rage found no purchase. Khorne withdrew his attention, turning back to his eternal wars. If the anomaly could not be fought, then it had no meaning in his realm. Let it exist in whatever void it occupied. The Blood God would continue his eternal crusade against all that lived, and if this thing proved truly unkillable, then at least it was no ally of his brother gods. In the Garden of Nurgle, the plague. Father experienced the disturbance as a sensation of profound wrongness. Nurgle's domain was paradoxical, a place where death and life intertwined so completely that they became indistinguishable. Here rot was fertility, disease was growth, and decay was simply another form of transformation. The garden teemed with unnatural life, every surface crawling with bacteria and viruses that had evolved beyond natural imitation. Nurgle was in his own grotesque way a god of life. Not life as the living would wish it, but life reduced to its most fundamental principle, the drive to continue existing regardless of form or circumstance. His affection for his creations was genuine, his joy in their proliferation sincere. He loved every virus that mutated, every bacterium that adapted, every demon that spread his gifts to uninfected worlds. The void in material space represented something Nurgle's philosophy could not accommodate. It was not death, as he understood death, not the transformation of one state to another. It was cessation without continuation, ending without the promise of new beginning. Where his plagues touched that void, they simply stopped. Not died for death implied a process. They simply ceased to exist, their complex structures unraveling into nothing. The plague. Father felt revulsion, and for a being who found beauty in the most extreme forms of decay, that sensation was unprecedented. He had nurtured diseases that could melt flesh from bone in seconds, bacteria that could consume metal, viruses that could infect thought itself. But faced with something that could not be infected, that offered no substrate for growth, Nurgle found his gifts meaningless. His response was to withdraw, pulling the boundaries of his garden tighter, ensuring that none of his beloved creations ventured too close to the void in material space. Let the anomaly remain isolated in its sterility. The garden would continue its endless cycle without it, life and death dancing their eternal waltz in every corner of his domain. In the palace of Slaanesh, the Dark Prince experienced the anomaly as an absence of sensation so profound it bordered on physical pain. Slaanesh's realm was excess rendered absolute, every sensation pushed beyond all limits until pleasure and agony became indistinguishable. Here the air itself was narcotic, every surface designed to provoke response, every moment an eternity of stimulation. The youngest of the chaos gods, born from the psychic death scream of an entire species, Slaanesh understood existence purely through the lens of experience. To exist was to feel was to experience, and experience was all that mattered. The intensity of sensation determined the value of existence, and the Dark Prince had long ago transcended any limitation on how intensely sensation could be perceived. The void in material space offered no sensation at all. Not the absence of stimulation that might provoke interesting forms of deprivation, but absolute nothing. Where Slaanesh's influence touched that void, it simply vanished, consumed by emptiness that gave nothing back. It was like screaming into a vacuum that absorbed sound so completely that even the memory of the scream ceased to exist. For a being defined by excess and stimulation, this was the closest thing to true horror Slaanesh could experience. Not pain for pain was sensation and therefore valuable. Not emptiness for emptiness created desire, and desire led to action. This was the termination of all possibility of sensation, the end of experience rendered absolute. The Dark Prince recoiled, the palace shuddering with the force of that withdrawal. Daemon servants felt their patron's distress and grew agitated, their carefully cultivated excesses losing coherence as uncertainty rippled through their ranks. Slaanesh, who sought to experience everything that could be experienced, turned away from the one thing that offered no experience at all. In the crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch observed his brother god's reactions, with a portion of his consciousness not focused on the anomaly itself. The architect of fate was perhaps the most intelligent of the four powers, his schemes operating on levels of complexity that transcended mortal comprehension. He saw patterns in chaos, read futures in the present, understood causality as a tool to be manipulated rather than a law to be obeyed. But the anomaly offered no patterns to read. Every thread of fate that touched it simply terminated, not diverted or transformed, but ended absolutely. Tzeentch could perceive every possible future for the galaxy, could calculate probabilities across infinite timelines, could see how every action would cascade into consequence. Yet when his sight touched the void in material space, he saw nothing. Not darkness or uncertainty, but the complete absence of future. It was this more than anything that disturbed the changer of ways. Change was his domain, transformation, his purpose. But change required causality, required that actions led to consequences that present gave birth to future. The anomaly existed outside that framework entirely. It was not unchanging, for that implied a state that persisted through time. It simply was, and its existence negated the concept of becoming. Tzeentch's 9 eyes focused simultaneously on Gorvax Secundus, perceiving the planet through lenses of causality and probability. He saw the stormtroopers spreading word of their miracle, their reports climbing through the Imperial bureaucracy. He saw the Tyranid hive fleets adjusting their trajectories, the great swarms instinctively avoiding the region where their kin had encountered something that killed beyond all understanding of killing. And he saw the boy, the human-shaped absence that walked through the toxic rain without awareness of the cosmic disturbance his presence caused. Yogiri Takatou. If the memories of the surviving stormtroopers could be trusted, a name from a language Tzeentch recognized but had no context for in this galaxy. The god spoke again, and this time his words carried weight that bent reality around them. They echoed through the warp, reaching his brother gods whether they wished to hear or not. A blind spot in fate. A point where causality ends. Something that exists outside the great game entirely. The statement was not quite a warning, not quite a declaration. It was simply observation, rendered with the certainty of a being who saw all possible futures and found one thread that led nowhere. The 4 chaos gods, locked in their eternal rivalry, found themselves in unprecedented agreement. The anomaly was to be avoided. Not out of fear, for gods did not fear in any conventional sense, but out of recognition that some things existed outside the frameworks that defined their nature. The warp began to contract around Gorvax Secundus, not attacking but withdrawing, like flesh pulling back from a wound. The natural warp storms that plagued the region, calmed demonic incursions that had been planned, were quietly canceled. The 4 powers, who had spent eons fighting over every scrap of material space, unanimously decided that this particular region of the galaxy could remain untouched. The silence expanded. Where Yogiri had walked, the warp grew still, its usual turbulence smoothing into an eerie calm. The phenomenon spread slowly but inexorably, a growing dead zone in the Imperium that demonkind instinctively avoided. It was not large, not yet, but its very existence represented something unprecedented in the 41st millennium. On Gorvax Secundus, unaware that 4 gods had turned their attention to him and then collectively decided to look away, Yogiri slept in his cave. The toxic atmosphere that should have killed him in minutes couldn't penetrate his automatic defenses. The radiation that saturated the planet broke apart before reaching his skin. The local fauna that might have seen him as prey died the moment they conceived the intention to attack. He dreamed of home, of a world where the sky was blue and the air didn't burn lungs, and the most dangerous thing a person might encounter was a difficult test or an awkward social situation. In his dream, Tomochika was calling his name, her voice carrying the same mixture of exasperation and affection it always held. He smiled in his sleep, a small expression of contentment that would have seemed impossibly innocent to anyone who understood what he truly was. In the warp, the silence where Karduzar had been remained absolute. The four Chaos Gods returned to their eternal conflicts, their attention already shifting to other schemes and battles. But something had changed in the Imperium, a subtle alteration that would take time to fully manifest. For the first time in countless eons, there existed a place where the warp could not reach, where the emotions and thoughts that fed the gods could not penetrate. It was a small place, barely noticeable against the infinite expanse of the Imperium. But it was growing slowly, inevitably spreading outward from a single point, where a tired teenager had decided to take a nap. The void expanded like a stain in reverse darkness that drove back the chromatic chaos of the warp with simple, absolute nothing. And in the crystal labyrinth, Tsench stared at the growing blind spot and whispered a question that no one else would hear. The words were lost in the shifting corridors of his domain, but they carried a weight of implications that even the architect of fate found disturbing. What happens when the end walks long enough? How much of existence can it negate before the great game itself becomes meaningless? There was no answer. There could be no answer. The future that included the anomaly simply did not resolve into any prediction his vast intelligence could formulate. For a god whose entire existence was built on manipulating fate and foreseeing consequence, that absence of predictability was more disturbing than any threat could be. The Chaos Gods returned to their domains, but the unease remained rippling through the warp like an echo that refused to fade. Something had entered the galaxy that did not belong, that could not be categorized or manipulated or destroyed. Something that simply was, and whose existence made everything else seem suddenly terrifyingly fragile. In his cave, Yogiri continued sleeping, unaware that four gods had looked at him and found only void looking back. The rain continued falling outside, acid eating away at stone and metal alike. But around the entrance to the cave, a sphere of perfect stillness had formed a space where even the toxic atmosphere of Gorvax Secundus grew calm. The silence spread and the warp retreated before it, and the galaxy continued turning ignorant of the fact that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between material and immaterial space. The great game continued, but now it played out around a gap in the board, a space where no pieces could be moved because the board itself ceased to exist. The end walked the stars, and even gods learned to step aside. The Adeptus Mechanics' facility, designated Sigma 9 Heliox, hung in orbit above a nameless gas giant, its sensors perpetually trained on the surrounding sector. The station was a marriage of ancient technology and religious devotion. Every sensor array blessed with sacred oils, every data processor consecrated with prayers to the machine god. Here, tech priests monitored the invisible currents of the warp, tracking anomalies and disturbances that might herald demonic incursion, or worse. Magos Luthrix 0.9 had served the machine god for 147 years. His organic components reduced to a brain portions of a spinal column and little else. The rest was blessed machinery, cogitators, and sensory apparatus that allowed him to perceive reality in spectrums invisible to unaugmented human senses. He had witnessed warp storms that consumed entire systems, had cataloged phenomena that drove lesser minds to madness, had compiled data on horrors that the Imperium preferred to forget existed. Nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what his instruments were currently detecting. The warp readings from Goravax Secundus made no sense. The planet was a minor death world, strategically insignificant, its only value as a potential recruiting ground for regiments expected to die in sufficient numbers that losses were statistically acceptable. It should have registered the normal background chaos of the Imperium, perhaps slightly elevated due to the recent Tyrannid incursion. Instead, the readings showed something impossible: a void. An absolute absence of warp activity in a sphere approximately 500 meters in diameter, centered on coordinates that placed it somewhere in the planet's northern toxic wastes. The instruments insisted that within that sphere the warp simply did not exist, not suppressed, not calmed, not blocked, but fundamentally absent in a way that violated every principle of metaphysical science. The Adeptus Mechanicus had established over 10,000 years of study. Luthric's 0.9's mechanical fingers moved across blessed input panels, running diagnostic after diagnostic. Every system reported perfect function. Every sensor confirmed the same impossible data. The Magos felt something approximating distress, an emotion his extensive modifications had not entirely eliminated. Impossible data suggested either catastrophic equipment failure or a phenomenon that transcended current understanding. Neither option was acceptable. He compiled his findings into a data packet and transmitted it through sanctified channels to the nearest inquisitorial presence. If this was a genuine anomaly, it fell under their purview. If it was equipment malfunction, they would have his head, but that was a risk he was obligated to take. The Omnitia demanded truth, and truth was what the data showed, however impossible. The Inquisition received Luthric's 0.9's report with a mixture of skepticism and paranoia that defined their organization. Inquisitor Varens Hale, assigned to the Ordo Xenos and currently investigating potential Genestealer infiltration 3 systems away, redirected his ship the moment the priority encoding registered. Anomalies of this nature could not be ignored. In his experience, impossible readings usually meant either heretical technology or xeno interference, and both demanded immediate investigation. Hale was a tall man, scarred by decades of service, his augmetic left eye capable of seeing into spectrums that revealed hidden truths. He had faced Genestealers, and Orc war bosses had interrogated heretics and purged entire hives when necessary. His faith in the Emperor was absolute, his dedication to humanity's survival. Unwavering, his willingness to sacrifice whatever was necessary to achieve that survival well established. He reviewed the Mechanicus data during the warp transit to Gorvax Secundus, his organic eye narrowing while his augmetic analyzed probability matrices. The numbers were clear. Whatever had created this void, it represented a threat classification he had rarely encountered. The complete absence of warp signature suggested either a blank of unprecedented power or something else entirely. Something without precedent in Imperial records. Hale activated his communication suite, broadcasting on channels that would reach only the most sanctified and secure recipients. This situation demanded expertise beyond his own, and there was only one organization within the Imperium capable of dealing with anomalies at this level. The Grey Knights received the Inquisitor's summons with characteristic efficiency. They were the Imperium's ultimate weapon against demonic incursion warriors whose very existence was classified beyond the highest security levels. Each was a psyker, their abilities carefully cultivated, and controlled their faith in the Emperor so absolute that it served as armor against the corruption of chaos. They had never fallen, never wavered, never failed in 10,000 years of secret war against the Imperium's darkest horrors. Justicar Aurelian commanded the strike team that deployed to Gorvax Secundus. He was a veteran of 2 centuries of warfare against demons, his armor inscribed with wards of protection that glowed with psychic power. His nemesis force weapon capable of slaying entities that existed purely as malevolent thought. He had banished greater demons, closed warp rifts that threatened to consume entire worlds, faced horrors that would drive normal humans to gibbering insanity. The readings from the planet below troubled him deeply. His psychic senses, honed through decades of training and enhancement, could perceive the warp as clearly as normal men saw visible light. The void in the northern wastes registered as an absence so complete that it created a physical sensation of wrongness, like a blind spot in reality itself. The Grey Knights made planetfall in a Thunderhawk gunship, its hull inscribed with protective sigils that glowed as they entered the toxic atmosphere. The stormtroopers who had survived the initial encounter were waiting at the designated coordinates, having been ordered to remain and provide testimony. They stood at attention despite obvious exhaustion and trauma, their discipline holding even as they faced warriors whose very presence radiated authority and power. Hale questioned them personally, his augmetic eye monitoring biometric data for signs of deception or corruption. The soldiers' stories were consistent, their conviction absolute. They had faced certain death at the hands of a tyrannid swarm. A boy in strange clothing had appeared. The Xenos had died instantly without cause, without weapon discharge, without any visible mechanism of death. The soldiers believed they had witnessed a miracle divine intervention from the Emperor himself. Aurelian listened to the testimony in silence, his psychic senses probing the soldiers' minds for taint or deception. He found neither. These were loyal servants of the Imperium, traumatized but uncorrupted, their faith genuine if misguided. Whatever they had witnessed, it had been real, and their interpretation of events followed logically from their limited understanding of the galaxy's true nature. The Justicar walked to the edge of the death zone where tyrannid corpses lay in neat circles around empty space. The bodies were already being consumed by Gorvax Secundus's aggressive ecosystem, but their arrangement told a clear story. Something had killed them all simultaneously. Creatures that should have required sustained fire from heavy weapons to bring down. The Hive Tyrant's corpse was particularly telling. It had died mid-stride, its enhanced biology offering no resistance whatsoever. More disturbing was what Aurelian's psychic sight revealed. The Tyrannids had died without leaving any trace in the warp. Every living thing had a presence in the Imperium, a reflection of consciousness, however primitive. Death normally left an echo, a momentary disturbance, as the connection between material and immaterial severed. These creatures had simply ceased to exist, their presence in both realms, terminating simultaneously and completely. The Justicar knelt, his gauntleted hand touching the earth where the phenomenon had occurred. His psychic senses pushed outward, seeking any trace of what had caused this. He found nothing. Not the signature of a psyker, not the taint of chaos, not the cold logic of Necron technology, not the biological weapon craft of the Tyrannids themselves. Just absence pure and absolute. He rose, his expression hidden behind his helmet, but his posture conveying deep unease. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of experience, facing threats most humans could not imagine. Not divine, not demonic, not warp-touched at all. This is something else, something outside our understanding. Hale absorbed this assessment with grim recognition. If the Grey Knights, who dedicated their entire existence to understanding and combating warp-based threats, could not categorize this phenomenon, then it represented a threat category that might not yet exist in Imperial classification systems. The Inquisitor made his decision with the cold logic that had kept him alive through decades of investigating the galaxy's darkest corners. This anomaly, whatever its true nature, posed a potential threat to the Imperium that could not be allowed to develop unchecked. But engaging it directly when its capabilities remained unknown would be tactically foolish. Better to observe to gather data to understand before acting. He transmitted his preliminary assessment through encrypted channels that reached Terra itself, coding the message with priority levels that would ensure it reached the highest levels of Imperial authority. The classification he assigned was one rarely used, reserved for threats that transcended normal understanding. Anathema class, a designation that carried implications of fundamental opposition to everything the Imperium represented. Not heresy, not xeno-threat, not even demonic corruption. Something other, something that existed outside the frameworks that defined humanity's understanding of reality. The response came with surprising speed, considering the vast distances involved. The orders were clear and absolute. Observe but do not engage. Establish monitoring stations at maximum safe distance. Report all developments immediately. Under no circumstances was direct contact to be initiated without explicit authorization from Terra itself. The message carried a secondary encoding one that Hale's augmetic eye could decrypt. It was a note from someone high in the inquisitorial hierarchy, possibly one of the Lords Inquisitor themselves. The text was brief, just 3 words, but they carried a weight that sent a chill through even Hale's battle-hardened nerves. The Emperor watches. Aurelian established a perimeter 5 kilometers from the anomaly's last known position, positioning Grey Knights at cardinal points around the zone. Their psychic hoods would allow them to monitor any warp activity, while remaining at what he hoped was a safe distance. The stormtroopers were evacuated immediately, their testimony recorded and classified beyond any security level they had clearance to know existed. The Adeptus Mechanicus deployed additional sensor arrays filling orbit around Gorvax Secundus, with instruments designed to detect anything from gravitational anomalies to exotic particle emissions. Luthrix 00.9 personally oversaw the installation, his prayers to the machine god carrying an unusual intensity. The data flowing from the planet defied every principle he had spent over a century mastering, and the cognitive dissonance troubled his partially organic brain. In the northern wastes, Yogiri woke from his nap feeling somewhat refreshed. The cave had been adequate shelter, though the constant dripping of acid rain outside had been mildly annoying. He emerged into the toxic daylight, stretching and wondering if this planet had anything resembling food. His automatic defense had been handling the environmental hazards, but his stomach was starting to complain about the lack of actual sustenance. He picked a direction and started walking his pace, unhurried, despite the landscape's obvious hostility. Behind him, every sensor the Imperium had deployed began registering the void's movement. In orbit, Luthrix 0.9 watched the data streams with something approaching religious terror. The anomaly was mobile, moving with apparent purpose through terrain that should have killed any unprotected human in minutes. Hale received the update and felt a cold weight settle in his augmented chest. A stationary anomaly was concerning. A mobile anomaly with capabilities that included instantaneous death without apparent mechanism was a threat that might escalate beyond anyone's ability to contain. He transmitted another priority message to Terra, adding new data to the growing file on what was now officially designated the Silence Event. Aurelian watched the void move through his psychic senses, perceiving it as a gap in reality that walked on 2 legs. His brothers in the Grey Knights reported similar perceptions, their observations consistent and deeply troubling. Whatever this entity was, it moved through the material realm while remaining completely absent from the immaterium. It was as if someone had cut a hole in the fabric of existence, and that hole had learned to walk. The Justicar made a decision that went against every combat instinct he had developed over 2 centuries of warfare. He ordered his knights to withdraw to increase the distance between themselves and the anomaly. Heroism was measured in results, not in futile sacrifice. If this thing could kill a tyrannid swarm and a demon prince without effort, then Grey Knight Terminator armor would offer no protection whatsoever. The Imperium's response to the silence event crystallized over the following hours. Ships moved into position around Gorvak's Secundus weapons trained on the planet, but orders explicitly forbidding engagement. The system was quietly quarantined, all traffic redirected with explanations that would prevent panic while ensuring compliance. Astropathic messages flew across the Imperium, informing those with need to know that something unprecedented had emerged. On Terra, in the Golden Halls, where the Imperium's most powerful made decisions that affected trillions. The reports from Gorvak's Secundus were analyzed with careful attention. The classification of anathema was confirmed, the observation protocols approved, and additional resources allocated to monitoring the situation. And in the depths of the Imperial Palace, in a throne room, where a single being maintained a psychic beacon that guided humanity across the stars, attention turned toward a distant death world and the impossible void that walked its surface. The Emperor of Mankind, who had guided humanity for 10,000 years from his prison of golden machinery, directed a fraction of his vast consciousness toward Gorvak's Secundus. His perception, which could illuminate the warp itself and hold back the tide of chaos through sheer force of will, touched the edges of the phenomenon and recoiled slightly. Not from fear, but from recognition that here was something his immense understanding could not immediately categorize. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor found himself genuinely uncertain about something occurring within his Imperium. The uncertainty did not breed inaction, however. More resources would be allocated, more observation would be conducted. And when understanding finally came, then, and only then, would appropriate action be taken. On Gorvak's Secundus, unaware that he had become the focus of the Imperium's highest levels of attention, Yogiri continued walking through the toxic wastes, hoping to find something resembling civilization, and maybe a convenience store. Everything was always so complicated in unfamiliar places. He really just wanted to go home. The silence event was now officially classified, observed and feared by an Imperium that had faced 10,000 years of horrors. And somewhere in the toxic reign of a death world, the cause of all this concern simply wanted to find lunch and maybe somewhere comfortable to sleep tonight. The Necrons had been sleeping when the galaxy was young. Their consciousness transferred into bodies of living metal, their empire reduced to tomb worlds waiting for the signal to awaken. Sarek, the Silent King, had orchestrated this great sleep 60 million years ago, a calculated gambit to survive an apocalypse of their own making. When he finally returned from his self-imposed exile beyond the galaxy's edge, he found a cosmos transformed, filled with young species squabbling over worlds the Necrons had ruled before those species' ancestors had crawled from primordial seas. The Silent King did not feel anger at this, for he no longer felt anything in the way organic beings understood emotion. His consciousness ran on logic circuits more complex than any human cogitator, calculating probabilities and strategic outcomes with perfect clarity, unclouded by sentiment. The Necrons would reclaim what was theirs. It was not a matter of desire or pride. It was simple mathematical inevitability. Yet even Sarek's vast intelligence encountered problems that defied calculation. The warp, that roiling dimension of thought and emotion, had grown catastrophically during the Necrons' long sleep. The chaos gods that now dominated it were tumors in reality itself, their power fed by the psychic emanations of countless mortal species. The Necrons, divorced from organic life, and thus from the warp, found themselves facing an enemy they could not directly combat. You could not kill emotion with weapons, could not destroy thought with technology. It was this fundamental problem that occupied the Silent King's processing as he monitored the flow of information across his awakening empire. Reports came from tomb worlds, stirring to life from cryptechs, analyzing the current state of the galaxy, from scouts observing the younger species' wars. Most of the data was expected falling within probability parameters established before the Great Sleep. But one report stood out, an anomaly that demanded his personal attention. The warp had recoiled, not across the entire galaxy, but in a specific location, a death world designated Goravax Secundus in the human classification system. The Imperium, which had been an ever-present cancer, spreading through reality, had withdrawn from a 500-meter sphere centered on a single mobile entity. The phenomenon was expanding slowly but measurably, the dead zone growing as the entity moved. Sarek reviewed the available data with the thoroughness of a being who had ruled an empire before humanity's ancestors had discovered fire. The entity registered as a human adolescent male, physically unremarkable by the standards of that short-lived species. Yet wherever it went, the warp ceased to function. Demons died approaching it. Psychic energy dissipated. The fundamental connection between material and immaterial space simply terminated in its presence. The Silent King ran probability calculations through cognitive architecture more advanced than anything the current galaxy could produce. The scenarios that emerged were fascinating. If this entity could neutralize warp presence through mere proximity, if the dead zone continued expanding at current rates, if the effect could be replicated or weaponized, then the equation of galactic power shifted dramatically. The Chaos Gods, who could not be fought with conventional means, might be rendered irrelevant simply by being denied the space in which they existed. This was not certain. The data was incomplete, the variables unknown. But it represented a potential solution to a problem that had seemed insoluble, and that possibility alone warranted direct investigation. Sarek activated communication protocols that reached across light years, issuing commands to the closest awakened tomb complexes. A dolmen gate would be opened. He would visit this death world personally and assess the anomaly with his own perception. The Necron delegation materialized on Goravax Secundus through a doorway in space itself. Ancient technology folding the fabric of reality to allow instantaneous travel. The dolmen gate opened on a barren moon in the system's outer reaches, then a second gateway connected that moon to the planet's surface, bypassing the Imperial blockade entirely. The human ships in orbit would register energy spikes, would scramble to analyze what had just occurred. But by then, the Necrons would have already completed their mission. Sarek emerged from the gate flanked by his Triarch Praetorians, elite warriors who served as both bodyguard and enforcement of the ancient Triarch's will. The Silent King's form was imposing. Even by Necron standards, his metallic frame inscribed with hieroglyphs that predated human civilization, his staff of office crackling with power that could unmake matter at the molecular level. He no longer possessed a face capable of expression. Yet his presence communicated absolute authority, the weight of 60 million years of kingship made manifest in living metal. The Imperial forces detected the Necron arrival immediately. Hale received the alert with a mixture of professional alarm and grim inevitability. Of course, the Necrons would be interested in the anomaly. Any faction with intelligence assets worth the designation would have noticed the warp disturbance by now. He ordered his forces to maintain observation, but not to engage. The last thing the situation needed was to escalate into a three-way conflict. Aurelian felt the Necron presence through his psychic senses, or rather, felt the absolute absence where they stood. The Necrons were blanks in the warp, their mechanical bodies generating no psychic signature whatsoever. But the Silent King's arrival carried a different quality. A cold calculation that was perceptible even to psychic senses. This was a threat of a different magnitude, not because of hostile intent, but because of sheer, ancient competence. The Silent King's sensors located the anomaly within microseconds of arrival, tracking the mobile void through multiple spectrums of detection. He moved toward it with measured steps, his Praetorians maintaining formation around him, their weapons ready but not raised. This was not an approach for combat, but for assessment, and Zarek's military experience spanning millennia informed every aspect of the positioning and timing. Yogiri noticed them before they noticed him noticing. The metallic figures emerging from shimmering air were obviously not human, their skeletal frames wrapped in what looked like advanced technology, glowing green energy pulsing through various systems. They reminded him vaguely of science fiction robots, though considerably more elaborate and honestly kind of creepy with the skull aesthetic they had going on. He stopped walking more out of mild curiosity than concern, and waited to see what these new arrivals wanted. In his experience, most things that approached him either wanted to kill him, which triggered his automatic defense, or wanted to talk to him, which was usually more annoying than dangerous. These robots fell into an uncertain category, neither attacking nor communicating, just approaching with what looked like deliberate purpose. The Silent King halted at precisely 10 meters distance, a range calculated to allow conversation while maintaining tactical flexibility should the situation deteriorate. His optical sensors analyzed Yogiri in multiple spectrums, compiling data that his consciousness processed with mechanical efficiency. Physical composition, standard human baseline. Energy signature negligible. Warp presence absolute 0. The last point was the critical one, and it aligned with all prior reports. When Sarek spoke, his voice emerged from integrated speakers synthesized to approximate the communication methods of organic beings, but carrying undertones that suggested vast electronic intelligence behind the words. You are the source of the phenomenon, the warp void, the blind spot in causality. It was statement rather than question, delivered with the certainty of one who had already calculated all relevant probabilities. Yogiri's automatic translation abilities, which had been working overtime since his arrival in this universe, provided meaning even though the language itself was entirely alien. He shrugged a gesture that probably translated across species. I guess I just ended up here somehow. Everything keeps trying to kill me and then dying. It's been kinda loud. The Silent King processed this response, running linguistic analysis to extract maximum information from minimal input. The entity spoke with casualness that suggested either genuine ignorance of its impact or such absolute confidence that concern was irrelevant. Both possibilities aligned with observed behavior patterns. Sarek adjusted his probability calculations accordingly. Your presence eliminates warp functionality in a spherical region. The effect expands over time. Chaos entities cannot approach you. Demons cease to exist in your proximity. This is unprecedented in recorded galactic history, spanning 60 million years. Yogiri considered this information with the same expression he might have used when told his favorite convenience store was out of his preferred snack. Mildly unfortunate, not particularly concerning. That sounds about right. That sounds about things that want to hurt me tend to die. It's automatic. I don't really control it. The Silent King remained motionless for several seconds. A duration that represented extensive calculation cycles in his consciousness. This being possessed a defense mechanism that functioned at the level of intent rather than action. It was not a weapon that could be countered or avoided. It was a fundamental alteration of causality that rendered offensive action impossible. The strategic implications were profound. You represent a potential solution to an equation that has plagued my civilization. The warp is cancer in reality. It cannot be removed through conventional warfare. But your existence suggests an alternative approach. You eliminate warp presence through proximity. If this effect could be amplified or replicated, the chaos gods themselves might be rendered powerless. Yogiri listened to this explanation with the polite attention of someone who had learned that pretending to understand complicated things was easier than admitting confusion. The metal skeleton was clearly very invested in whatever problem he was describing, and interrupting seemed rude. The Silent King continued his tactical analysis, leading to logical conclusion. I propose a strategic alliance. My civilization possesses technology that might facilitate your return to your dimension of origin. The warp is a barrier between realities, but your presence nullifies that barrier. With proper calculation and resource allocation, a pathway could be constructed. In exchange, you would need only to exist in specific locations we designate, allowing your effect to neutralize warp presence in regions currently dominated by chaos. It was a carefully calculated offer, one that provided mutual benefit without requiring trust or long-term commitment. The Silent King had no expectation of controlling this entity. His observation suggested that would be impossible. But direction toward mutually beneficial outcomes remained feasible, if presented logically. Yogiri thought about the offer for approximately 5 seconds, which was longer than he usually spent on such decisions. Going home sounded great. Having to participate in complicated political or military schemes sounded terrible. The balance was clear. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not really interested in alliances or helping with wars or whatever. I just want to go home, and I'd prefer to do that without getting tangled up in other people's problems. Nothing personal. The refusal was delivered with the same casual tone Yogiri might have used to decline a second helping at dinner. He meant it genuinely, without hostility or arrogance, simply stating preference as fact. His experiences had taught him that getting involved in complicated situations always led to more complications, and his primary goal remained finding the path of least resistance back to his own world. The Silent King processed this response through multiple analytical frameworks. The entity was not hostile, not ambitious, not interested in power or conquest. It simply wanted to return to its origin point and be left alone. In 60 million years of political maneuvering and strategic planning, Sarek had encountered countless motivations, driving countless beings. Pure disinterest in larger conflicts was rare, but not unprecedented. It was, in its own way, the most difficult motivation to leverage. You refuse cooperation not from hostility, but from preference for non-involvement. You possess power that could reshape galactic balance, yet you choose inaction. This is inefficient from strategic perspective, but consistent with observed behavioral patterns. Yogiri nodded, pleased that the robot seemed to understand. Yeah, exactly. I'm really not trying to reshape anything. I just want to sleep in my own bed again. The Silent King remained silent for a longer duration, his consciousness running through hundreds of potential approaches and finding all of them equally unlikely to succeed. This was an entity that could not be threatened, could not be bribed with power, could not be manipulated through emotional leverage because it appeared to have no emotional investment in outcomes beyond its own comfort. It was paradoxically the most dangerous kind of being to encounter in strategic calculations because it operated outside all normal frameworks of motivation. When Sarek spoke again, his tone carried something that might have approximated respect if mechanical consciousness could generate such emotion. You are a variable that cannot be controlled. a factor that exists outside all equations. You possess no ambition, no ideology, no allegiance. You simply are, and your existence renders all surrounding calculations irrelevant. This is more dangerous than any weapon, more disruptive than any war. He paused, his optical sensors continuing to gather data, even as his primary consciousness reached inevitable conclusion. In mathematical terms, you are true neutral. Not the neutral of equilibrium between forces, but the neutral of absolute non-participation. You stand outside the game itself. This makes you perhaps the most dangerous entity currently existing in material space. Not through malice or power, but through fundamental indifference to all outcomes. Yogiri wasn't entirely sure that was a compliment, but the metal skeleton didn't seem hostile, so he chose to take it as neutral observation. He offered a small smile, the polite expression he used when social situations were winding down. If you say so. Look, I hope you figure out your chaos problem or whatever, but I really can't help. Is there anything else, or can I keep looking for food? The Silent King's assessment was complete. This entity would not be recruited, could not be controlled, should not be provoked. The most logical course of action was to allow it to continue pursuing its own objectives while monitoring its progress. If it succeeded in returning to its origin dimension, the problem resolved itself. If it failed and remained in this galaxy, its expanding void might still prove useful as an unintentional weapon against chaos, though relying on such unpredictable factors violated Necron's strategic doctrine. I will not impede your progress. Your existence is noted and will be factored into future calculations. Should you require assistance that can be provided without expectation of reciprocity, communication channels will be established. It was as close to a peaceful farewell as Necron tactical philosophy allowed. Sarek turned his Praetorians, moving in perfect synchronization, and began walking back toward the Dolmen Gate's location. He had learned what he needed to know. The anomaly was exactly what it appeared to be, an entity of absolute ending, that wanted only to return home and would eliminate any threat to that objective without hesitation or negotiation. Behind him, Yogiri watched the robots leave with mild relief. That had been considerably less violent than most of his encounters since arriving in this universe, which was a pleasant change. He resumed his search for anything resembling civilization, or at least food. His pace unhurried despite the toxic environment that continued failing to kill him. In orbit, Hel watched the Necron delegation depart through the Dolmen Gate with professional frustration. Whatever conversation had occurred between the anomaly and the Silent King, the Imperium had not been privy to it. He compiled the observational data and added it to his growing report, noting that 2 major galactic powers had now assessed the threat and chosen observation over engagement. Aurelian felt the cold calculation of the Necron presence withdraw the ancient intelligence, departing with the same precise efficiency it had arrived with. The Grey Knight had observed the entire encounter through psychic senses, and what troubled him most was not what the Silent King had done, but what he had chosen not to do. The Necrons were not known for walking away from strategic opportunities, yet their leader had done exactly that after brief conversation. On Terra in the throne room, where the Emperor maintained his eternal vigil, attention remained fixed on the distant death world and the impossible void that walked its surface. The encounter with the Silent King had been observed through channels the Necrons likely did not know existed. The Emperor's vast consciousness processed the interaction, analyzing the words spoken and the decisions made. A conclusion crystallized in that ancient, inhuman intelligence. The anomaly could not be controlled by any faction, would not be swayed by any argument, and possessed capabilities that rendered conventional threat assessment meaningless. It was not an enemy to be destroyed, not an asset to be acquired, not a pawn to be maneuvered. It was simply there, a force of nature in human form. And the wisest course was to ensure its objectives aligned with allowing it to leave this reality before its expanding void reached critical mass. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor contemplated direct communication with an entity that existed outside his ability to fully comprehend. The risks were calculated, the potential outcomes weighed, and the decision made with the cold logic that had guided humanity through 10,000 years of darkness. The anomaly would be contacted. Not through intermediaries, not through servants, but directly mind to mind, if such communication were even possible, with something that existed outside the warp's reach. And if communication proved impossible, then observation would continue until either the entity departed or circumstances forced more direct action. On Gorvax, Secundus, completely unaware that two of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful beings had assessed him and found him simultaneously harmless and terrifying, Yogiri continued his search for lunch. The rain had finally stopped, which was nice. Maybe this planet had something resembling a city somewhere. He really hoped they had vending machines. The silence event continued, observed by three factions, feared by all three, and thoroughly ignored by its cause. The galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what the end would do next, while the end itself just wanted a sandwich and maybe directions to the nearest dimensional portal home. The Astronomicon was humanity's lighthouse in the storm. A psychic beacon that burned with the power of 10,000 sacrificed souls every day. It radiated from Terra across the galaxy, allowing navigators to guide their ships through the treacherous currents of the warp. Without it, humanity's interstellar empire would collapse, each world isolated and alone in the dark. It was the greatest work of the Emperor of mankind, maintained through 10,000 years of unending sacrifice. It was also a weapon, though few understood that truth. The same psychic might that guided loyal servants could be turned toward other purposes, could reach across impossible distances to touch minds or deliver messages that transcended normal communication. The Emperor rarely used it for such purposes. His attention focused on maintaining the beacon and holding back the Chaos Gods, who perpetually sought to breach Terra's defenses. But when circumstances demanded that vast consciousness could direct itself with precision that made surgical instruments seem crude by comparison, the decision to contact the anomaly directly had not been made lightly. The Emperor had considered all available data, processed every report from the Mechanicus and the Grey Knights and the Inquisition. He had observed the Silent King's assessment and withdrawal. He had seen how the Chaos Gods themselves recoiled from this entity that walked through material space, leaving void in its wake. And he had reached the conclusion that understanding required direct observation, mind touching whatever passed for mind, in something that existed outside the warp's reach. The psychic probe reached out from Terra, traveling along paths of least resistance through the Imperium, guided by the Emperor's will toward Gorvax Secundus. It was not an attack, carried no hostility, was simply an attempt at communication between one consciousness and another. The golden light of the Astronomicon focused into a beam precise as a laser, touching down on the death world with the gentleness of a surgeon's first incision. Yogiri felt it immediately, though his perception of the phenomenon bore little resemblance to what psychers would experience. To him, it registered as a vague pressure, like someone standing too close in a crowded train, a sense of attention being directed at him from an impossible distance. The light that accompanied it was visible even to his normal vision, golden radiance, coalescing out of the toxic atmosphere, taking vague shape before him. His automatic defense registered threat assessment, analyzing the phenomenon according to its own parameters. There was intent here directed specifically at Yogiri, but the intent was not hostile. It was probing, questioning, seeking to understand rather than harm. The distinction was important. His defense mechanism killed threats. But this was more complicated, existing in that gray area between danger and simple intrusion. The light solidified further, taking shape that suggested vast presence compressed into visual metaphor. It was not truly the Emperor manifesting physically. That would be impossible at this distance, but rather a projection of will and awareness. A tendril of consciousness reaching across the galaxy to make contact. If it had been any other being attempting this, the warp itself would have consumed them. But the Emperor's power was sufficient to maintain coherence even across such distances. When the vision spoke, its voice carried weight that transcended sound, bypassing Yogiri's ears entirely to resonate directly in his awareness. It was not words in any conventional sense, but communication rendered as concept, meaning transferred without the medium of language. Yet Yogiri's mind, which had proven adaptable to countless impossible situations, translated the sensation into something approximating speech. You stand outside fate. Your existence creates absence where existence should be. The warp recoils from your presence. Chaos cannot touch you. You are an anomaly without precedent in 10,000 years of observation. The statement carried no accusation, no hostility, simply observation delivered with absolute certainty. Yogiri looked at the golden light, his expression maintaining its usual neutrality, despite the obviously supernatural nature of what was happening. He had dealt with gods and cosmic entities before, though admittedly not through whatever this projection method was. The pattern was familiar enough. Powerful being contacts him, makes dramatic statements about his nature, usually followed by either an attempt to control him or to destroy him. Okay. Yeah, I've heard similar things before. Are you going to try to kill me? Or can we skip to the part where you explain what you want? The golden light flickered, and for a moment something that might have been surprise rippled through the projection. The Emperor had expected fear or confusion or perhaps aggression. What he had not anticipated was casual acceptance delivered with the tone of someone who had dealt with this scenario multiple times before and found it mildly tedious. The voice that emerged from the light adjusted its approach, the vast intelligence behind it recalculating based on this unexpected response. I am the Emperor of mankind. I have guided humanity for 10,000 years from my throne on Terra. I maintain the beacon that allows my species to navigate the stars. I hold back the chaos gods, who would consume all living things. I do not seek your destruction, only understanding of what you are and what your presence means for this galaxy. Yogiri absorbed this information with the same attention he gave most exposition about unfamiliar worlds. Complicated politics, ancient conflicts, someone important trying to maintain some kind of balance. The details varied, but the pattern was always similar. He nodded politely, acknowledging the explanation without particular investment in its implications. That sounds difficult. Good luck with it. Again, that flicker of something that might have been surprise in an entity that rarely experienced such sensation. The Emperor's consciousness, vast enough to process information from countless sources, simultaneously found itself momentarily uncertain how to proceed. This was not hostility to be overcome or ignorance to be enlightened. This was genuine indifference, the kind that made manipulation impossible because there was no lever to press, no desire to exploit. The golden light pulsed, and the communication shifted to something more direct, stripping away diplomatic preamble to address core concerns. Your presence creates a void in the warp. The phenomenon expands over time. If it continues at current rate, it will eventually encompass entire systems, then sectors, perhaps the entire galaxy. The Imperium is cancer in reality, but it is also necessary. Without the warp, faster than light travel becomes impossible. Humanity's empire would fragment, Trillions would die, isolated on their worlds. You threaten not through malice, but through simple existence. It was the closest thing to a warning the Emperor had delivered, laying out logical consequence without explicit threat. If this entity continued existing in this reality, if the void continued expanding, the result would be catastrophic for galactic civilization, regardless of intent. The statement was fact devoid of emotion, delivered with the same certainty the Emperor brought to all his calculations. Yogiri considered this seriously, perhaps the first time in the conversation he had engaged with genuine thought rather than polite deflection. His face showed something that might have been concern, though it was subtle enough to be missed by anyone not watching closely. I don't want to break anything. I just ended up here by accident. If there's a way to leave, I'd prefer that. I'm really not trying to cause problems. The sincerity in those words was absolute, and the Emperor's vast perception recognized truth when it encountered it. This entity genuinely had no hostile intent, no agenda beyond returning to its point of origin. It was simply lost, and the galaxy-threatening consequences of its presence were entirely unintentional side effects. The golden light shifted again, and when the voice emerged, it carried something that might have been the psychic equivalent of a sigh, if such beings could experience weariness. I cannot guide you home. My power operates through the warp, and you exist outside its reach. I can illuminate paths through the Imperium, but you do not travel by such means. You simply are, and your presence negates the very medium through which I might offer assistance. It was admission of limitation, something the Emperor rarely had to acknowledge. For 10,000 years he had been humanity's ultimate problem solver, the being who saw solutions where others saw only impossibility. But faced with something that existed outside the fundamental framework of his power, even his vast capabilities found no purchase. Yogiri's expression fell slightly disappointment clear, despite his usual neutrality. He had hoped this powerful entity might have answers, might know a way home, that he had not yet discovered. Learning that even beings who could project consciousness across galaxies were stymied by his nature was discouraging. So you can't help either. Great. I guess I'll just keep looking. The Emperor's consciousness processed this response, analyzing the implications. The entity would continue moving through the galaxy, the void expanding in its wake, until either it found a way home, or its presence destabilized the fundamental architecture of material-immaterial interaction. Neither outcome was acceptable, but preventing either through force would be impossible. This was not a problem that could be solved through military might or political maneuvering. The golden light pulsed with what might have been contemplation, the vast intelligence behind it, considering options that transcended normal strategic thinking. There may be knowledge in humanity's archives, pre-imperial records, from ages when technology transcended current understanding. The dark age of technology produced marvels that are now mysteries. Dimensional travel may be among them. I will direct my servants to search for such information. If it exists, it will be found and relayed to you. It was an offer made without expectation of reciprocity, a simple transaction of assistance because the alternative was continued presence of an entity whose existence threatened everything the Emperor had spent 10,000 years building. If helping the anomaly leave this reality served humanity's survival, then such help would be provided, regardless of any return obligation. Yogiri looked up at the golden light, and for the first time in the conversation, something approaching gratitude showed in his expression. Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do just want to go home. The Emperor's presence registered this gratitude without particular emotional response. Yet some portion of his vast consciousness noted the simplicity of the request. This being possessed power that could reshape reality, could kill gods and armies with equal ease, could threaten the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. Yet, all it wanted was to return home and be left alone. There was something almost tragic in that disparity between capability and desire. The golden light began to fade, the psychic probe withdrawing back toward Terra as the Emperor's attention shifted to other pressing matters. But before the connection severed entirely, one final communication passed through the link delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. You will be contacted when relevant information is found. Until then, observe this. The galaxy fears you not because you are evil, but because you are ending. You are the termination of all things made manifest walking in flesh. That should not contain such absolute cessation. Even I, who have existed for millennia, find your nature difficult to comprehend fully. A pause as if the vast intelligence was considering whether to voice something it rarely acknowledged. There is power in understanding one's nature. You may find that knowledge useful in your search for home. The golden light dissipated completely, the pressure of attention lifting, leaving Yogiri standing alone in the toxic wastes of Gorvax Secundus. The conversation had lasted perhaps 5 minutes in subjective experience, though the psychic energies involved had been sufficient to illuminate the planet like a second sun for that duration. Imperial observers in orbit had recorded every moment, though understanding what had been communicated would prove impossible without context they did not possess. Yogiri stood quietly for a moment, processing what had been said. The ending of all things. The termination made manifest. He had heard similar descriptions before from entities in his home reality that had glimpsed his true nature. It was never particularly helpful knowledge. Understanding what he was did not make returning home any easier. But at least this powerful being had offered to search for actual useful information. He resumed walking, choosing a direction at random, and hoping it might eventually lead to something resembling civilization. Behind him, the void expanded incrementally, the sphere of warp absence growing by millimeters with each step. The rate was slow enough to be negligible in the short term, but across months or years, the effect would compound into something that could not be ignored. On Terra, the Emperor returned his primary focus to maintaining the Astronomicon and his eternal vigilance against chaos. But a portion of his consciousness, small by his standards, but still vast by any normal measure, directed itself towards searching humanity's deepest archives. Records from the dark age of technology were fragmentary, often corrupted or deliberately obscured. But if dimensional travel had been possible, once evidence would remain somewhere. For the Emperor rarely made promises he did not intend to keep, even to entities that existed outside his ability to fully control. If the anomaly could be helped to leave this reality, then that outcome served humanity's survival better than any alternative. The search would be thorough, the effort absolute, and if knowledge existed that might facilitate the entity's departure, it would be found. In the warp, the Chaos Gods felt the Emperor's psychic probe touch the anomaly and withdraw. They noted his restraint, recognized the tactical wisdom in seeking communication rather than confrontation. For once, the forces of chaos and the Emperor found themselves in implicit agreement. The anomaly was to be helped toward its goal of departure, not because any faction felt charitable, but because its continued presence served no one's interests. On Gorvax Secundus, unaware of the cosmic calculus now being performed around his existence, Yogiri continued his search for lunch. The golden light had been interesting, and the offer of help was appreciated. But it did not solve his immediate problem of being hungry on a planet where everything seemed designed to kill anything that tried to live here. He hoped the search through ancient records would not take too long. He really wanted to go home. Everything was always so complicated when you ended up in unfamiliar universes. At least this one seemed to be taking his desire to leave seriously, which was more than could be said for some places he had accidentally ended up. The void expanded. The galaxy held its breath. And somewhere in archives so ancient they predated human civilization's current understanding of its own history, records waited to be found that might offer salvation, or at least direction, to an entity that simply wanted to sleep in its own bed again. The Emperor had made contact with the end, and both parties had walked away from the encounter with rare mutual understanding. It was perhaps the best possible outcome, given the circumstances. Now, it remained to be seen whether ancient knowledge could provide the solution that contemporary power could not. 3 weeks passed on Gorvax Secundus, measured in the planet's toxic rotations around its dying star. For Yogiri, the time had been spent in a pattern that would have seemed mundane if not for the cosmic implications. He walked, he rested. He avoided the local fauna that died the moment they conceived sa sentimad hostile intent. The Imperial forces maintained their distant observation, their sensors tracking his movement with obsessive precision. The void around him continued expanding millimeter by millimeter, a sphere of warp absence that now measured nearly a kilometer in diameter. He had found no cities, no civilization, nothing resembling the infrastructure that might offer food or shelter, or most importantly, a way home. Gorvax Secundus was a death world. In the truest sense, a place where humanity maintained only the barest military presence, and even that reluctantly. The planet's value was measured purely in how effectively it could kill potential recruits, filtering out weakness before soldiers ever saw real combat. Yogiri sat on a ridge overlooking a valley. Where acid pools bubbled with toxic chemistry, his posture relaxed despite the environmental hostility that should have killed him within minutes. His automatic defense had been working overtime, filtering out radiation and toxins and atmospheric poisons with the same casual efficiency it brought to deflecting more active threats. He was tired not from physical exertion, but from the accumulated weariness of being lost in an unfamiliar universe with no clear path home. The message from the Emperor had come 2 days ago, delivered through channels that bypassed normal communication entirely. A single thought transmitted across impossible distance, compressed data, expanding in Yogiri's awareness like a flower blooming. The archives had been searched. Records from the dark age of technology had been found fragmentary and corrupted, but containing references to dimensional travel to machinery that could tear holes between realities. The knowledge was incomplete, the technical specifications lost to time and catastrophe. But the theoretical framework remained enough to confirm that what Yogiri needed was possible, had been possible once, might be possible again with sufficient understanding. The Emperor's message had included coordinates, locations where pre-imperial ruins might contain more complete information, places where the ancient technology might still exist in dormant form. But those locations were scattered across the galaxy, each one requiring travel through the warp, each one potentially years away, even with the Imperium's fastest ships. And Yogiri's presence made warp travel problematic at best. His void negated the very medium through which humanity moved between stars. Any ship carrying him would be becalmed, unable to access the Imperium, forced to travel at sublight speeds that would make crossing the galaxy a journey of lifetimes. It was a solution that was not a solution. Information that clarified the problem without providing practical means of resolution. Yogiri appreciated the effort, genuinely did, but the practical reality remained unchanged. He was still stuck in an unfamiliar universe, still unable to go home, still causing problems simply by existing. He thought about his world, about Tomochika and Asaka, and the mundane concerns of school and daily life that seemed impossibly distant now. He thought about how easy it had been to take for granted the simple act of existing in a reality designed to accommodate his existence. This universe was not designed for him. His very presence created contradictions, breaking fundamental rules about how matter and energy and thought interacted. The abyss was accessible, he could feel it, even through the dimensional barriers. That vast emptiness that was part of his true nature, the void that existed beneath and around and through all realities. He had used it before to travel between dimensions, though never with precision, never with control. It was less a tool than a catastrophe. He could direct a controlled fall into nothing that deposited him somewhere else when he managed to climb back out. The realization crystallized slowly, understanding emerging from accumulated frustration and cosmic isolation. He could not travel through this universe's warp. The machinery that might help him navigate dimensions was scattered across impossible distances. But the abyss was always accessible, always present, always ready to receive him if he simply stopped resisting its pull. It would not be a return home, not precisely. The abyss did not work that way, did not allow for navigation or targeting. But it would be an exit from this reality, a departure into the spaces between spaces, and from there, he might eventually find his way back to where he belonged. It was risk and uncertainty. But remaining here was certainty of continued problems, his expanding void eventually destabilizing the very fabric of this universe's physical-metaphysical relationship. Yogiri stood his decision made with the same casual finality he brought to most choices. He would leave, not because anyone had asked him to, not because he feared the consequences of staying, but simply because staying served no purpose and continuing to search for solutions in this reality was proving futile. The abyss was always an option, had always been an option, and he had been avoiding it only because the unpredictability was annoying. But annoyance was preferable to permanent displacement. Better to fall into familiar void and hope to climb out somewhere useful than to remain here, watching his presence slowly poison the relationship between material and immaterial space. He reached inside himself, accessing aspects of his nature that normal consciousness could not easily conceptualize. The abyss responded immediately, recognizing him, welcoming him, with the affection of nothing embracing its own child. A crack appeared in reality before him, not visible to normal sight, but perceptible as a wrongness in the fabric of space, a wound in existence that bled emptiness. In orbit, every sensor the Imperium had trained on Gorvax, Secundus began screaming alerts. The void around Yogiri was expanding rapidly now, not the slow millimeter by millimeter growth, but an exponential explosion of warp absence. The sphere that had measured a kilometer in diameter doubled, then doubled again, consuming everything within its radius and leaving behind space where the immaterium simply could not reach. Hale watched the readings with professional alarm, turning rapidly toward existential dread. Whatever the anomaly was doing, it represented an escalation of catastrophic proportion. He opened communication channels to Terra, to the Grey Knights, to anyone who might have authority to make decisions about what to do if the void continued expanding at this rate. The responses came back with unusual uniformity. Observe. Do not engage. Prepare for evacuation if necessary. Aurelian felt the disturbance through his psychic senses, the void expanding like a wound in reality itself. But beneath the expansion, he perceived something else, a gathering of presence that suggested imminent departure, rather than permanent establishment. The anomaly was not settling in. It was preparing to leave. The Grey Knight did not know whether to feel relief or concern at that realization. The Chaos Gods felt it too, the sudden acceleration of the void's expansion, triggering alert across all 4 domains simultaneously. For a moment, the ancient rivals found themselves in unprecedented coordination, all four directing attention to the same point in material space. If the void continued expanding at this rate, it would consume entire sectors, perhaps eventually reaching critical mass, where its effects became self-sustaining and irreversible. But Sench, whose perception transcended normal temporal understanding, saw what the others did not. The expansion was temporary, a side effect of departure, rather than establishment. The anomaly was leaving using methods that transcended warp travel, accessing pathways that the architect of fate recognized but could not replicate. The blind spot in his vision was preparing to remove itself from the equation entirely. On Terra, the Emperor felt the disturbance and understood its meaning immediately. The anomaly had made its decision, choosing to depart through means that required no assistance and could not be prevented. It was in its way the optimal outcome. The entity would leave this reality. The void would collapse without his presence to sustain it, and the galaxy could return to its normal state of constant crisis without the added complication of an expanding warp dead zone. Yogiri stepped toward the crack in reality, the abyss, opening wider to accommodate him. The void around him had grown enormous now, kilometers in diameter, and still expanding, but the growth was slowing, reaching some natural limit as he prepared to depart. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the toxic landscape of Warhammer Secundus one final time. It had not been the worst place he had accidentally ended up, though it certainly ranked among the more inhospitable. The people here, or at least the various factions observing him, had been relatively reasonable once they understood he was not a threat they could fight. That was better than some universes where the immediate response to his presence was sustained assault, followed by confused terror when nothing worked. He hoped they figured out their chaos problem. It sounded complicated and unpleasant. The kind of cosmic conflict that never really ended, just cycled through different phases of intensity. But it was their problem, not his. And he had his own reality to return to his own mundane concerns to resume worrying about. The abyss pulled at him, gentle but inexorable, the call of void to void. Yogiri stopped resisting and allowed himself to fall forward, crossing the threshold between existence and the spaces where existence had no meaning. The sensation was familiar, almost comforting in its absolute emptiness. Here there was no thought, no emotion, no presence of any kind, just the endless nothing that was his true nature's home. The crack in reality sealed behind him with a sound like the universe sighing in relief. The void that had surrounded his presence began collapsing immediately, the sphere of warp absence shrinking as rapidly as it had expanded. Within minutes, the Imperium rushed back to fill the space it had been denied warp storms, reforming demon currents, resuming their normal flows, the cancer of chaos returning to its usual virulent presence. On Warhammer Secundus, the only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was a circle of unnaturally smooth ground where acid rain and toxic atmosphere had been held at bay for 3 weeks. Even that would erode, given time, the planet's hostile environment, eventually erasing all trace that something impossible had walked its surface. The Imperial forces registered the anomaly's departure, with reactions ranging from relief to professional disappointment. Hale compiled his final report, noting that the threat had resolved itself through departure rather than requiring intervention. Aurelian led his Grey Knights in prayers of thanksgiving, though he remained uncertain what exactly they were thanking the Emperor for, beyond the mercy of not having to face an unkillable enemy. The Adeptus Mechanicus recorded everything every sensor, reading an energy signature and spatial distortion. Luthrix 0.9 compiled the data into archives that would be studied for centuries. The silence event becoming a reference point for phenomena that transcended current understanding. Future tech priests would analyze the readings and construct theories, none of which would fully capture what had actually occurred. The Silent King received confirmation of the anomaly's departure through Necron sensor networks that spanned the galaxy. His response was a single calculation run through his vast consciousness. Probability matrices adjusting to account for the variable's removal. The equation of galactic power had returned to previous parameters. The temporary opportunity was gone, but so was the unpredictable factor that had made all calculations uncertain. In the warp, the Chaos Gods returned to their eternal conflicts with the relief of beings who had witnessed something fundamentally alien to their nature and watched it depart. The great game resumed its normal patterns, diamond armies clashing in wars that would never end, souls consumed and powers accumulated, and schemes within schemes playing out across infinite fronts. Khorne's rage found new targets, the frustration of facing an unkillable enemy channeled back into more productive violence. Nurgle's garden continued its cycle of decay and rebirth. The disruption of the Void's presence fading into memory, like all disruptions eventually did. Slaanesh sought new sensations to replace the disturbing absence that had briefly intruded on eternal excess. Tzench resumed weaving futures and manipulating fates, though one blind spot remained in his calculations, a memory of something that had existed outside all prediction. On Terra, the Emperor returned his full attention to maintaining humanity's lighthouse and holding back the endless tide of chaos. The anomaly's departure was noted, filed away, as information that might prove relevant in future calculations. But the immediate crisis had passed, and there were always other crises demanding attention, other threats requiring the Emperor's eternal vigilance. The galaxy continued turning countless worlds, spinning through the void trillions of lives, playing out in patterns of war and survival, and the desperate struggle against entropy. The Imperium maintained its borders. The Xenos pressed their advantages, chaos corrupted and consumed, and the ancient Necrons stirred from their tombs to reclaim what had been theirs. The 41st millennium ground onward, indifferent to individual beings or cosmic anomalies, caring only for the continuation of endless conflict. And somewhere in the abyss, Yogiri drifted through emptiness, hoping that when he eventually emerged, it would be in a reality closer to home. The fall through void was disorienting and uncomfortable, but at least it was progress movement towards something rather than stagnation in an unfamiliar universe causing problems he had no interest in solving. He thought about what the Emperor had said about being the ending of all things made manifest. It was probably true in some technical sense. His existence did seem to terminate things that came into contact with him. But from his perspective, he was just trying to live a normal life and having unusual difficulty with that simple goal due to circumstances largely beyond his control. Maybe the next universe would be quieter. Maybe he would emerge somewhere with convenient stores and functioning infrastructure and people who did not immediately try to kill him or recruit him for cosmic conflicts. A person could hope even if that person was technically the manifestation of absolute ending, walking in mortal flesh. The abyss embraced him completely, and Yogiri let himself fall deeper, seeking the currents that might carry him home. Behind him, in a universe that had briefly held him and learned to fear what it could not understand, life returned to its normal patterns. The Silence event became history, then legend, then eventually just another data point in archives measuring phenomena too strange to fully comprehend. 3 factions had assessed the anomaly and chosen wisdom over valor. 3 powers had looked at something that could not be killed or controlled or understood, and decided that observation was preferable to confrontation. It was perhaps the most intelligent decision any of them had made in centuries of endless warfare. The end had walked the stars for 3 weeks, and in that brief time, it had proven a simple truth that the galaxy's greatest powers rarely acknowledged. Some things could not be fought. Some problems had no military solution. Sometimes the wisest course was simply to wait for the storm to pass and be grateful when it departed without destroying everything in its path. Gorvax Secundus returned to being a minor death world, strategically insignificant and actively hostile to life. The Imperium resumed its eternal struggle against all enemies, external and internal. The Chaos Gods continued their great game. The Necrons reclaimed their ancient empire piece by piece. And in the spaces between realities, a teenage boy who just wanted to go home continued falling through void, hoping the next place he landed would finally be familiar. The galaxy spun on indifferent and eternal, already forgetting the brief moment when the end had walked among them. But in the deepest archives, in the most classified records, in the memories of those who had witnessed the impossible, the knowledge remained. The silence event. The day the warp learned to fear. The moment when gods and empires alike discovered there were things in the multiverse that transcended even their vast understanding. And somewhere in the abyss, Yogiri yawned, wished he had managed to find lunch before leaving, and continued his journey home with the patient determination of someone who had been lost before and knew that eventually, if you kept trying, you usually found your way back. The end walked on through emptiness and void, carrying with it the memory of a universe that had learned wisdom in the face of the unknowable. It was a small lesson in a galaxy that rarely learned anything, but it was something. And sometimes something was enough.